Hi there, I'm Rosie D, and you're listening to WQAT-LP FM 99.5. We are the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E. Church, the downtown church here in Greenville, South Carolina. Coming up next is Chris McCauley, Ph.D. Dr. Chris McCauley is also a writer, theologian, and expert in Celtic folklore, and will speak with us about the pagan roots of Halloween.
This is Michael Forsyth on WQAT, radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E., the downtown church in Greenville, South Carolina. Today is Halloween, the favorite night of the year for American children. But as most of us know, the holiday has pagan roots, and as a result, many Christians want nothing to do with it. But is it really sinister or satanic? We're going to speak with a very special guest who will shed light on Halloween. Irish-born writer Chris McCauley is a co-founder of the Stokerverse, who worked with our earlier guest, Dacre Stoker, to create the graphic novel The Virgin's Embrace, and has many other published works. He holds a Ph.D. in theology and is an authority on Celtic mythology. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
I understand that Halloween was originally a Celtic holiday. Who were the Celts, and what can you tell us about that holiday?
Yeah, the Celts were a pastoral people. They weren't an industrialized agricultural nation. And Halloween, or Samhain, as it's called, was about the end of summer, because that was particularly significant to them. It was the time of year when the structure of their lives changed radically. The cattle were brought down from the summer pastures in the hills, and people were gathered into the houses for the long winter nights. And long winter nights meant storytelling and handicrafts. So yeah, that's you can sort of chart a little bit of Halloween and the storytelling and the making of decorations maybe from that.
So, in its most fundamental level, it was a harvest festival, really.
Yeah, it was a harvest festival. Samhain in the English Irish dictionary is sort of defined. It's also defined as All Hallowtide, the Feast of the Dead, in pagan and Christian times, signalling the close of the harvest and initiation of the winter season. Winter season lasted until May for the Celtic people. And it's particularly interesting because there's no archaeological or literary evidence to indicate that Samhain was a deity or a lord of the dead. It was primarily a harvest festival. Samhain Eve and the day of the celebration itself were not any particular festivals for any specific Celtic deity. Instead, it acknowledged the entire spectrum of non-human forces that roamed the earth during that period. So it's a harvest festival, but it's also a festival of the dead as well.
And I was interested to read that the sun was central to this holiday. Was the sun a big part of Celtic culture?
Yeah, I mean, every mythology has a link to the sun. With the Celts, we have the sort of, it's very similar to Beltane. There were bonfires that were lit on top of hills in Samhain. And it suggested that the fires were kind of imitative of sympathetic magic. They mimicked the sun and sort of helped the powers of growth to hold back decays and darkness of winter. They also served to symbolically burn up and destroy all harmful influences. And there's various accounts from the 18th and 19th century to suggest that the fires, smoke and ashes that came from these bonfires were thought to have protective and cleansing powers. Now, in Scotland, these bonfires were lit by a form of friction, or the Scottish termed it as force fire, and this force fire was seen as magic. In reality, they came from a stone wheel that had a hole bored out in the middle, and a log would have been put in between the hole. So the wheel would be turned. The friction of the stone wheel touching the timber would cause a spark, and it would light the bonfire. So the wheel is representative of the sun. There's also accounts of two bonfires being lit, and the farmers would take their livestock through the through the middle of the two bonfires, and this was a form of blessing. Villagers would also take flames from the bonfire back to their homes in the form of torches. And in parts of Scotland and in Southern Ireland, the torches of this burning turf were carried sunwise, so east to west in the direction of the sun, around homes and fields to protect them. And this sort of bonfire, the observance of the bonfire continued in the family home. The communal sort of fireplace for the family would be extinguished on Samhain or Halloween night to be relit again in the next day. There's a 17th century writer called Geoffrey Keating who claimed that this particular practice was an ancient tradition that was instituted by the Druids.
Now, you mentioned the Druids, and we have an image of Druids as being somewhat sinister figures. Who were the Druids exactly?
Well, the Druids were like the wise men of the community. They performed various functions, ceremonial functions, hand fasting, which would be the pagan form of wedding. They had obviously the link to the burial of the dead, but they had a very, very important function in society. They told the farmers when to actually plant their crops. And they did this because they knew the mysteries of the heavens, or as we understood, astronomy. So they were able to look at the star systems and see where they were. So they knew when winter was coming. So they knew when the best time to plant spring was, when the best time to reap was, and when to prepare for the winter. And that was really the base of their power. They were also mathematicians. They were skilled in the art of geometry. And one of the most fascinating places in Ireland is it's a place called Newgrange. It was built 5,000 years before the pharaoh Khufu built his first pyramid in Egypt. So they understood geometry. Now in Newgrange, and nobody really knows what Newgrange was for. It might have been a place for high kings to congregate, or for ceremonies to take place, burial ceremonies. But very specifically, there's a little hole, and just as the sun rises, there's the Venus star, or Lucifer, and as it rises, it goes into the hole and creates a pattern around the walls. People might know it. It's a circular pattern that you see quite a lot in Celtic symbology. So that's really who the Druids were.
That is just fascinating. Well, so we have the sun, and we have a harvest celebration. Seems quite benign. Where it gets spooky is this idea that during this period of Samhain, the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead can be breached, and the spirits of the dead, as well as other beings, can come over to our world. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, the Celts believed that when people died, they went to this land of eternal youth and happiness called Tir na Nog. They didn't have a concept of heaven and hell that later civilizations had, and the Christian church ultimately brought into the land as well. The dead were always seen to be dwelling with the fairy folk, who lived in numerous mounds, and these mounds were called She. And the mounds dotted across the Irish and Scottish countryside. So Samhain was also the new year for the Celts. So in the Celtic belief system, turning points such as the time between one day and the next, or the meeting of the sea and shore, or the turning of one year into the next, they were seen as magical times. So the turning of the year was the most potent of these times. It was at this moment that the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest, and the living could communicate with their beloved dead in Tir na Nog.
Well, I read something, and maybe you can correct me or explain this a little more, that the ancient Celts, they actually dressed in costume. They dressed as animals and monsters so they would not be possessed by spirits. Is there anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's simple psychology. To not be afraid of the monster is, you become the monster, right? So that's why people dress up in that form of costume at Halloween to scare away, the spirits. More modern psychologists look at the concept of masks, and the mask we're able to embrace our own inner fears. I mean, this is why kids dress up as Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers from Halloween. It's really to defeat their fears. But yeah, it was a practice that was used. The Celts used it. It was more a form of entertainment in a way as well. What you had was that the dead would be invited to the homes, and that gave the families a chance to interact with spirits until they left the following evening. So children would play games to entertain the dead, and adults would update the dead on the past year's news. And generally on that night, doors and windows would be left open for the dead to come in and eat cakes that had been prepared for them. But there was always maybe a few bad spirits that would come. So that's why people would dress up to try and scare them away in turn.
Well, you mentioned fairies, which most modern Americans, think of fairies as very benevolent creatures, maybe slightly mischievous sometimes. But how did the Druids and the Celts see fairies?
Well, fairies, or the Fae, they're creatures that inhabit a world that are invisible to humans. So most European nations have their own fairy tradition, and each of them have their own origin stories that are unique to them. Fairies first appeared in Ireland in the early 12th century and are heavily intertwined with the lore of the dead. As mentioned previous, that's where Celtic people believed that the souls of the dead went to be with the fairies. So some of the first tales of fairies sort of come from that belief of the dead living on in the burial chamber. The ancient Irish believed that the fairies were the first settlers of Ireland. These people were known as the Tuatha Dé Danann, and they conquered all of Ireland until they were defeated by the Milesians. The Milesians were the ancestors of the modern Irish people, and during this time period, the fairies or the Danann went into hiding and lived in the hills. And the fairies aren't like Tinkerbell from Disney stories. They were described as being the same height as normal people and being dressed in elegant green clothing. They had abilities such as being able to turn invisible and changing their appearance. They were almost like gods to mortal people, and they had interests such as music. They encouraged war and encouraged people to hunt as well. Their musical abilities were especially revered, and some of the best musicians of the time credited their works to fairies. Now, later on, with the advent of the Christian Church in Ireland, fairies were seen as angels who were cast out of heaven by God. So there's a particular tale that depicts God opening the floor of heaven and casting Satan and his other angels out. The angels who fell onto land first became land fairies, and the angels that fell into the sea became sea fairies. So these exiled fairies spent their time attempting to get back into heaven by stealing children's blood. So that's when fairies start to take on a slightly darker tone. They're also seen as mischievous, and they can cause misfortune to happen onto households. So you never curse a fairy or refer to them by their name, and we sometimes call them as the noble folk or good folk, just to remain on their best side. In fact, fairies are invisibly seen to dwell in the doorways of homes, especially.
Well, we know that there are these fairies wandering around on this special day, and there are the spirits of the dead, but there were also some other monsters that were kind of out and about. Can you just tell us a little bit about those?
Oh, yeah. Now, I'm going to make an absolute mess of the pronunciation of these monsters' names, but they are fascinating. There was the Puka, who was a shape-shifting creature that received the harvest offering from the field. So again, we go back to the harvest concept. We've got a lady Glynn, who was a headless woman dressed in white, who chased night wanderers with a massive giant pig that was black. And then you have the sort of the precursor to the headless horseman, Dullahan. And it's they could appear as impish creatures, or most often headless horsemen who carried their heads riding flame-eyed steeds. And anybody who's watched the Sleepy Hollow film with Johnny Depp will be familiar with that. And their appearance was like the Banshee, a deaf woman, to anyone who encountered them. And then there was a group of hunters known as the Fairy Host, who would hunt Halloween night, and they would kidnap people. And then, the Thaw, and they would come from the west to enter homes and steal souls. So there was all sorts of, very imaginative creatures that were fashioned out of stories that storytellers would tell. The storytelling aspect for these Celtic festivals and these dark nights is extremely important, because the storytellers who were professional, they would wander from home to home and basically get their food and board for telling a really good story. That was a profession in Ireland.
And was that thing of the fairies playing tricks, does that have something to do with that later, the development of the trick or treat idea?
No, it's trick or treat's interesting. Trick's more about actually performing a little like a trick or a performance, or things like that, and that comes into mumming around the Middle Ages. So as sort of mentioned previously, some of the Celtic celebrations, you had villagers that would disguise themselves in costumes made of animal skins to drive away nasty phantom visitors. In later centuries, people dressed up as ghost demons and other creatures in exchange for food and drink. That practice is known as mumming, and was the sort of precursor to trick-or-treating. So poor people would visit the homes of welfare families and receive pastries called souls cakes in exchange for a promise to pray for the souls of homeowners' dead relatives. And then it was a practice that was taken up later by children who would go door to door asking for gifts like money, food and ale. And yes, we drink very early in Ireland. So that morphed into a tradition called guising in Scotland. So you would dress up in costume and accept offerings from various households. So rather than pledging to pray for the dead, they would sing a song, recite a poem, or perform a little trick. So like stand on your head or do a cartwheel before collecting their treat. And the treat would generally be fruit, nuts, or coins.
That is so cool. So much of it is, you can see how it's reflected in what we do in modern times. Well, how did the Christian church leaders reframe Samhain as a Christian celebration? How did that happen?
Yeah, it started in the 5th century, and Pope Boniface started that by trying to move the celebration to the 13th of May and used it as a day to celebrate saints and martyrs. The Irish, being thick-headed, didn't like that and continued on their pagan practices during the festivals of October and November. So then the church finally admitted defeat in the 9th century. Pope Gregory moved the celebration back to the traditional time and declared it All Saints' Day on November the 1st and All Souls' Day on November the 2nd. So October 31st then became All Hallows' Eve. Now, it still continued many of the traditional pagan practices, and really it survives because it was adopted into 19th century America through Irish immigrants. I know in Ireland that the Catholic Church encourages the celebration of Halloween, and it's not seen as anything that's terribly sinister.
Yeah. Well, so All Hallows' Eve, as it was called by the church, becomes Halloween.
Yes.
So now, let me ask you this. It starts off as a pagan or pre-Christian holiday, festival. It becomes, in our culture, increasingly secularized. There's not really a trace of, other than in the trappings of its original purpose. But now, Wiccans, modern-day witches, people consider themselves white witches, have adopted Halloween or Samhain as a holiday. Could you tell us what's that like?
Yeah, well, Wicca, as far as I understand, I'm not an expert Wicca, but there was a Gerald Gardner revitalized it, sort of brought about a new neo-pagan religion and termed it as Wicca, and attempted to follow some of the earlier practices of now pagan just means country person, by the way. Pagan doesn't have any sort of magical or mystical meaning. It just means country person. So that the older tradition that people in the countryside would practice. And look, it's a very evocative time. You've got like ghoulies and monsters and all sorts of things, in people's imagination. So, of course, it's a great festival for anybody who practices witchcraft to latch onto.
Yeah.
The rational mind sometimes halts a little bit on Halloween. It's part of our culture. It's part of our nature. It has been for a long time. So it's just something that we're culturally programmed. I don't believe in ghosts or spooks or anything like that. But on Halloween night, there's always a little pause because we've been conditioned to believe that maybe it's possible. So, I could see it as being a very potentially potent holiday for anybody who wants to believe in that sort of stuff.
Sure. So as we wrap up, let me ask you, should modern-day Christians see Halloween in a negative light as a pagan ritual or as something positive with deep roots in our culture?
I would never tell anybody how they should see any festival or any event in life. There are aspects to Halloween that possibly might give rise to concern. For anybody who practices the Christian faith, I enjoy some horror films that you've got the good guys versus the bad guys, and the good guys always win. But there's some of the later films like the Saw films and Hostel and those that they're almost glamorizing violence a little bit too much. Don't get me wrong, as a horror writer, I write violent scenes, but I try and inject some redeeming characters in there as well. I think that's really important. The concept of light versus darkness in whatever form you believe that takes is fundamental to our society, and it's fundamental to us as human beings. So in that aspect, I get where Halloween, as it is now, is very positive. It's the negative stuff of, for example, I walked past a Halloween person who had decorated their house for Halloween and saw them with gravestones with famous serial killers, and I'm not sure that we should be venerating the names of people who are serial killers. Should they be worried about infestation of demons and various nasties and all of that sort of stuff, and Satan reaching up under their bed at night to touch their cold toes? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing about Christianity for me is the concept of giving to the poor, to help the needy, to be more Christ-like. I leave the business of demons and devils to others, and I think more about the business of Christ and the sacrifice for your neighbour. I think that's infinitely more powerful than worrying about the forces of heaven and hell. Let them go about their own business. As a human being, you have your business to attend to. And the most powerful aspect of that is charity. And to constantly try and make yourself a better person through the teachings of the Christian faith in this instance.
Yes. Well, Chris, let me ask you this. If someone is interested in finding out more about you and your work, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, the best way is to go onto Facebook and search for Stokerverse. And they'll find all the parts of our work and what we're doing and what we're up to next. Our publishers are AUK, Hellbound Books, and Scar Comics, with more to come. And I'm also published in the Hollywood Reporter now. So if they want to pick up the latest issue of the Hollywood Reporter, they'll get an exclusive Stokerverse story. And there's various games, both electronic and traditional, coming out next year as well, from Crooked Dice Studios, Nightfall Games, and Trinity Knot Studios.
Well, I'm really looking forward to a lot of that stuff, and then there's a writer you're working with that I just can't wait to see what you guys come up with. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, mate. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You've been listening to our discussion about Halloween with Chris McCauley, Ph.D., a writer and expert on Celtic mythology. This is Michael Forsyth on WQAT, the radio station of Allen Temple A.M.E., the downtown church in Greenville, South Carolina.
You have just listened to Dr. Chris McCauley, Ph.D. You can also find Chris McCauley's latest graphic novel, The Vampire's Embrace, on Amazon.com and learn more about his collaborations with Dacre Stoker by visiting stokerverse.com. Again, I'm Rosie D. Please stay tuned because there is more on the way here on WQAT.